The Lure of the Jorogumo. The mist hung low in the mountains, weaving through the trees like ghostly fingers. Hiroshi adjusted the straps of his backpack and glanced nervously at the dense forest surrounding him. The air felt heavier here, a weight pressing down on his chest as though the mountain itself breathed with quiet menace. He had heard the tales, of course. Every child growing up in the rural outskirts of Japan had. The elders spoke of a creature both beautiful and terrifying, a spider-woman known as the Jorogumo. She was said to dwell in places like these, secluded mountain regions far from human interference. She lured men with her beauty, wrapping them in her charm before revealing her monstrous form to devour them. But standing there now, surrounded by silence so profound it seemed unnatural, he felt a chill run down his spine. The forest path was overgrown, the stones slick with moss. Hiroshi had ventured here on a dare from his university friends. They'd been drinking the night before when the topic of urban legends came up. Someone had mentioned the Jorogumo, and before he knew it, Hiroshi had boasted that he wasn't afraid of old wives' tales. A round of laughter and taunts later, he had agreed to spend a night alone in the mountains as proof of his courage. Now he wasn't so sure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Hiroshi found a small clearing to set up his tent. The shadows stretched long and thin, merging into the encroaching darkness. He lit a small campfire, the flickering flames casting eerie shapes on the surrounding trees. But then a sound cut through the stillness, a soft melodic humming. Hiroshi froze, his hands stilling as he unpacked his gear. The sound seemed to drift through the trees, ethereal and beckoning. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky. The humming stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then a figure stepped into the clearing. She was beautiful, strikingly so. Her long black hair cascaded down her back like a silken waterfall, and her kimono, patterned with intricate spiderweb designs, shimmered in the firelight. Her eyes were dark and enigmatic, holding a glint of something unnameable. After an encounter with beautiful Aiko, he discovers the chilling truth of her monstrous nature as he battles for his life against her deadly enchantment. "I didn't mean to startle you," she said, her voice as smooth as honey. "I heard your fire and thought I'd see who was here." Hiroshi stood, his heart pounding. "I didn't think anyone else would be out here." She smiled, a delicate curve of her lips that sent a strange thrill through him. "I live nearby. It's rare to see travelers in these parts." Her gaze lingered on him, and Hiroshi felt an odd sensation as though invisible threads were wrapping around his mind, pulling him closer. Her gaze lingered on him, and Hiroshi felt an odd sensation as though invisible threads were wrapping around his mind, pulling him closer. Her gaze lingered on him, and Hiroshi felt an odd sensation as though invisible threads were wrapping around his mind, pulling him closer. The woman introduced herself as Aiko and asked if she could join him by the fire. Hiroshi, unable to refuse, nodded quickly. She sat gracefully, her movements almost inhumanly fluid, and began to talk. Her voice was mesmerizing, each word weaving a spell that held him captive. They spoke for hours, though Hiroshi later couldn't recall much of what was said. All he remembered was the way her eyes seemed to pierce through him, as though she could see every secret he had ever held. The way her laughter sent shivers down his spine, both delightful and unnerving. At some point, she reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was cool, her fingers impossibly soft. "You must be tired from your journey," she said, her voice low. "Let me help you relax." Hiroshi felt his eyelids grow heavy. The firelight blurred and the world seemed to tilt. A strange, silken scent filled his nostrils, sweet and cloying. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and uncooperative. As his vision darkened, he saw Aiko's smile widen, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. Hiroshi awoke to darkness. His body was immobile, bound by something sticky and unyielding. Panic surged through him as he realized he was suspended in midair, his arms and legs encased in what felt like strands of silk. "Ah, you're awake!" Aiko's voice drifted through the gloom, but it was different now, lower, more guttural. The fire had burned out, and the clearing was illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. Hiroshi turned his head with great effort and saw her standing there, her kimono discarded. Her true form was grotesque, her her torso still human, but her lower half transformed into the bloated body of a spider. Long, spindly legs emerged from her sides, and her eyes had multiplied, glittering like black jewels in the moonlight. "Don't look so frightened," she cooed, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You'll make a delicious meal." Hiroshi struggled against his bindings, but the silk only tightened, cutting into his skin. Aiko watched him with amusement, her fanged mouth curling into a grin. "Humans are so predictable," she said, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. "Always so easily lured by beauty. Did you truly believe a woman like me would be wandering these woods alone?" As she spoke, Hiroshi felt a strange sensation creeping into his thoughts. Her voice seemed to burrow into his mind, planting images and ideas that weren't his own. He saw her hands caressing his face, her lips brushing against his, and felt an overwhelming desire to submit to her. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, "this isn't real." "Oh, but it is," Aiko purred. "You see, my silk doesn't just bind the body, it binds the mind. Soon you'll beg me to devour you." Her laughter echoed through the clearing, a sound that made Hiroshi's blood run cold. Desperation surged within him. He forced his thoughts away from her voice, focusing instead on the memory of his friends, of the life he still wanted to live. With a Herculean effort, he managed to free one arm, the sticky strands snapping with an audible twang. Aiko hissed, her spider legs clicking menacingly as she moved closer. "You can't escape," she snarled. "You're already mine." But Hiroshi had found a shard of flint near the fire pit. He grabbed it and swung wildly as she lunged at him. The sharp edge caught her in the side and she shrieked, her human face contorting with rage. Taking advantage of her momentary distraction, Hiroshi tore himself free from the web and stumbled into the forest. Branches clawed at his face and arms, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. But he didn't stop. He could hear her behind him, her monstrous legs skittering across the forest floor. "You can't run forever!" she screamed, her voice a mix of fury and hunger. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together in the moonlight. Hiroshi's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he pushed on. Finally, he saw the faint glow of dawn breaking through the trees. With a final burst of energy, he broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a mountain road. A passing truck screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, rushing to help him. "What happened to you?" the man asked, his face pale as he took in Hiroshi's disheveled appearance. Hiroshi tried to speak, but could only manage a strangled gasp. He collapsed to the ground, his vision swimming. As the driver called for help, Hiroshi's thoughts drifted back to the forest. He could still feel her eyes on him, could still hear her laughter echoing in his mind. Far away, hidden in the shadows of the trees, Aiko watched him with a smile. She had let him go, for now. After all, the best prey was the one that believed it had escaped. Weeks later, Hiroshi sat in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive, but he didn't feel lucky. The nightmares wouldn't stop, and sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, he swore he could feel the faint pull of invisible threads tightening around his soul. And in the corners of his vision, just out of sight, he sometimes caught a glimpse of a shadow, a beautiful woman with a knowing smile and dark, glinting eyes. The Jorogumo was patient. She always came back for her prey.